It's always best if the colors in an image look similar to you when you're preparing the image in Photoshop, as those colors will look to your viewers when they see the image later in their web browsers. The best way to accomplish that is to emulate in your copy of Photoshop the way that colors will appear in a typical web browser on a typical computer monitor. So before you work on any images for the web, take the time to configure Photoshop's color settings with that goal in mind, as I'll show you how to do now. To access Photoshop's color settings, I'll go to the Edit menu and I'll choose Color Settings. There are lots of controls here. Fortunately, I don't have to set each one of the fields in this dialog box individually. Instead, I'll go up to the Settings menu and I'll choose an umbrella preset that affects multiple fields in this dialog box. For web work, I suggest choosing North America General Purpose 2, even over this choice, North America Web Internet. As I said, that preset controls the other fields in this dialog box. The most critical of those is the RGB working space, which determines the characteristics of the color environment in which RGB images will be displayed in my copy of Photoshop as I'm working on them. The preset I chose changed the RGB working space to sRGB. sRGB is the best choice for web work because it's the working space that most closely resembles the color characteristics of a typical PC monitor, which is what most viewers use to surf the web today. It's true that sRGB contains a relatively narrow range of colors as compared to broader color spaces that are used for print work, like Adobe RGB, Color Match RGB, and ProPhoto RGB. But the narrower range of colors in sRGB is what the typical web viewer will see on his or her monitor, so that's the color setup that I want to emulate in my copy of Photoshop. The only one of these working spaces that I'm interested in right now is the RGB working space. That's because images for the web have to be in RGB color mode. Web browsers can't display CMYK or grayscale images, so I'll skip over those settings. Next, I'll check the color management policies here, in particular the RGB color management policy. Choosing the umbrella setting North America General Purpose 2, set the RGB color management policy to preserve embedded profiles. This refers to the fact that a description of the color environment, called a color profile, can be attached to an image when the image is saved. Preserve embedded profiles means that if I happen to open an image that was saved with a color profile that's different than my sRGB working space, say Adobe RGB, then Photoshop will respect that other color profile, in this case Adobe RGB, and won't try to change it. And because all of these checkboxes are unchecked due to the North America General Purpose preset, when I do open a mismatched image, Photoshop won't force me to make some decision about color management at that point. It will just open the image. Now that I've changed my color settings for the web, I'll click OK. And I'm now working in the sRGB working space. So that's the first step in a color managed workflow for the web. Now, let's say I happen to open an image that I'm preparing for a website that doesn't match my sRGB working space. In other words, an image that's been tagged with a color profile other than sRGB. Here, for example, is an image that was created in an Adobe RGB color environment, and the creator saved it with the Adobe RGB profile, as I can see down here in the Document Information area. If you can't see that, you can press this arrow and choose Document Profile. Another indication that I have a mismatch between the profile attached to this image and my working space is the fact that there's an asterisk up here next to the bit depth in the title bar of the document window. My next step with a non-matching image like this one is to convert the image to sRGB so that it does match the sRGB working space. If I'm going to edit the image here in Photoshop proper, I can convert it to sRGB by choosing Edit, Convert to Profile, and then setting the destination space profile to sRGB. But I'm not going to do that now because I want to show you another way to convert an image to sRGB, so I'll cancel out of this dialog box. Let's say that I have no edits to make to this image. All I want to do is to make a copy of this PSD file in a web-ready format like JPEG and optimize it for display on the web. In that case, it's quicker and easier to convert the image to sRGB while I'm optimizing. To do that, I'll go to the File menu at the top of the screen and choose Save for Web and Devices. This opens this big Save for Web and Devices window where there are lots of settings. I'm going to address this window in great detail in later chapters. For now, it's enough to know that on the left is the original PSD image, and on the right, there's a preview of the image as it will look optimized for the web. The colors in the Adobe RGB original look rather washed out in my sRGB working environment. But the colors in the optimized preview on the right don't. That's because by default, this Convert to sRGB command is checked, so that the preview on the right displays how the image will look converted to sRGB. If I uncheck that, here's how the image would look without conversion, rather dull like the original, and here's how it looks with conversion. So I do want to leave this checked. Another thing to keep in mind is that images often appear darker and sometimes bluer on a PC than they do on a Mac, because the gamma of the two platforms is different. So it's also a good idea to use the preview menu here to check how the image might look on a Mac versus on a PC. By default, the preview menu is set to represent my particular monitor, but if I want to see how the optimized preview would look on a typical Mac, I'll click there and choose Legacy Macintosh. In this case, it's very similar to my monitor, because I am working on a Mac. And if I change that menu to Internet Standard RGB, you can see that the image looks darker as it might on a typical PC monitor. These previews are just approximations, but if they reveal significant shifts in color, brightness, and image detail, especially on the platform that most of my viewers are going to be on, I could always click Cancel to close the Save for Web and Devices window, go back into Photoshop, make some exposure or color corrections there to compensate, and then reopen the Save for Web and Devices window to optimize the corrected image. For now, I'll go up here and set my preview back to monitor color, which is the default setting. One more thing here related to color management. I'll usually leave Embed Color Profile checked, which is the default behavior here. This ensures that the sRGB color profile to which I'm converting the optimized version of this file will be embedded in the saved image. There are a few web browsers that can read color profiles like that, so attaching the profile ensures that the colors in the image will be displayed properly in those web browsers. The downside of embedding a color profile in an image for the web is that will increase file size very slightly. But that increase in file size isn't very significant in most cases, so as a general rule, I do leave Embed Color Profile checked, in the expectation that more web browsers will be able to read color profiles as time goes on. Now, assuming that I've set all the rest of the controls in this window as I want them, I'll save the optimized copy of this file for the web, as you'll see me do many times in this course, by clicking the Save button, and in the Save Optimize As window, navigating to where I want to save, and then clicking the Save button. And I've saved a file that's been converted to sRGB and to which I've attached the sRGB color profile for any web browser that can read it. So the lesson is that when you're trying to manage color in your web images, first do go to Photoshop's color settings and choose sRGB as the working space. Then if you do happen to open an image that's tagged with a profile other than sRGB, convert that image to sRGB, which is done most easily in the Save for Web and Devices window. This is the best way to match the colors that your viewers will see in your image on the web to the colors that you've seen in the image as you've been working on it in Photoshop.